Hello, I'm Jackie Lucky, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at financial planning professionals and also those who are looking to enter the financial planning profession. We will be talking during the podcast about all things Certified Financial Planner certification related, talking to other CFPs around the world, and also we will be dropping in on some new entrants who've just entered the financial planning profession, and we'll be checking up along the way on a regular basis with them to see how they're getting on. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lucky, your financial planning maestro. And today we are talking about all things Certified Financial Planner related. And I'm joined by a very special guest who has recently become a CFP professional by passing the CISI Level 7 Case Study Assessment. And that is Chris Harris, who's a financial planner with RBC Brewin Dolphin. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Jackie.
Thanks very much for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
That's no problem.
We're going to get into your journey to become a CFP just in one moment. But before we get into all of that, I've got stacks and stacks of questions to ask you. But I'm going to start at the very beginning. Give us a little potted history about how you got into the financial planning profession.
Yeah, so my background is not actually in finance. I started in education, so I started in teaching. So I kind of had an interest in kind of finance, economics when I was at school. To be fair, I was a bit strange in terms of from that. Nobody else really did that. And then I went to university and studied chemistry. And then after that, I went into education. So I taught secondary science. And then I suppose it was at that point I kind of worked in education, and they give you a tax-free bursary to work in it. And then it was a point when I was buying my first house, and I sat in front of a mortgage advisor who kind of helped us get to buy a property. And my situation was quite difficult because I didn't really have a large deposit or anything like that. So I was fascinated to see how he could, help us get a property. And he did somehow. He managed to get us a mortgage, and that kind of inspired me in terms of, okay, I quite like the kind of stuff that he's doing, problem solving, et cetera, et cetera. And then it kind of, when I was in education, when I was in teaching, I thought, well, it's something that I wanted to do anyway, the finance side, at some point, I just didn't know when. And I thought I would take the plunge and kind of change career completely. That was about 8 years ago. And effectively I retrained, just quit my kind of full-time role, went into supply teaching to kind of free up some time, and did my diploma and kind of never looked back since, I suppose.
Wow, fantastic. What a brave move, but obviously something that you're, becoming increasingly passionate about, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was just something where, something which I would have done anyway. And I think a lot of my kind of fellow students when I was teaching, when I went to university to study chemistry, a lot of them went off to do finance roles. It was quite a common thing. They didn't use their chemistry degree. They kind of used it in finance, and accountancy was quite a big thing. But I knew I didn't want to kind of sit in front of computers all the time. I wanted to talk with people, because that's the type of, the type of person I would prefer to be, is, helping people and talking to people, and financial planning kind of blends that kind of mixture of helping individuals and people with, the financial side. So it was a good mix for me.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, their loss is our gain. Absolutely. Yeah. So tell us a bit about how you came across Certified Financial Planner and why you decided to embark upon it.
Yeah. So when I started in financial planning, I worked in a company that I kind of cut my teeth in the company, but it offered kind of a narrow range of different investments, and it kind of preferred to look at occupational schemes, really. And it was kind of at that point where I thought, right, I want to kind of broaden my knowledge. I want to kind of broaden what I'm doing and actually practice what I'm doing. So I had kind of two options. Two things I needed to do. One was to kind of move into a company that had a broader range, that kind of looked at estate planning and protection, etc. And the second one was to kind of advance myself personally, and I suppose, use my kind of practice, obviously, in the job to kind of broaden myself professionally. So yeah, I moved into a different company, which doesn't do that. And then my other objective was to kind of study for, really kind of broaden my knowledge to that degree. And so I spoke to a few people in the previous company who actually did the CFP. And I was looking around at different options, for kind of advancing it. And they said, oh yeah, it's a really good idea to do it, but it's really, really hard. It's
Tough,
really
yes.
challenging and tough. But for me, I kind of suffer a little bit from imposter syndrome. I always think that, other people will kind of know a lot more things than what I do. So I wanted to kind of challenge myself and stretch myself to try and kind of rid some of these thoughts away from my head. And the CFP one was the highest qualification, in terms of the levels. It's a level 7 qualification. So for me, that was a real challenge. And I thought, right, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of go down that route and really kind of stretch, my knowledge and see how far I can go with it.
Wow. And so you sat the level 6 exam first with the CISI, did you? And then moved on to the level 7?
I did, yeah. So I sat the level 6 first, which I didn't think was too bad. I was a bit kind of apprehensive about it. I was thinking, okay, well, do I know enough stuff? Do I know what I'm doing? But I found it not too bad. I kind of sit there with various kind of mind maps and loads of other things to kind of, revise it, and loads of past papers and just kind of do it the old fashioned way, really.
Yeah. I think past papers are really key with an exam like that, because that one's so broad, isn't it? That you kind of don't know what's going to come up until you sit down and open the paper itself, do you?
Well, that's it. And I think it's kind of training yourself as well about kind of sustaining that kind of focus, because it's a 3-hour exam. So it's quite a meaty exam, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. So it's about kind of staying focused, and the timing is critical. When you've got a large amount of time to do, you might think, oh, well, that makes it easier, but actually it doesn't. You've really got to kind of be, efficient with your time and make sure that you're kind of addressing as many points as you can. So it's I suppose like a traditional exam, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So you passed that, and then what happened? Did you decide to go straight on to the level 7 case study, or did you have a little pause there, a little lie down in the dark room before carrying on?
I went straight into it. I did think about it. I thought, well, do I kind of take a gap? Because at that time it was November, and I thought, well, Christmas is coming up, and I thought, right, what do I do? Do I kind of defer it until the following year, or do I just do it now? So I kind of just took the route just to get on with it, really.
Just dive straight in.
Yeah, I think if I defer it, I'll end up just either kind of putting it off or finding excuses to not do it. So I just did it, and then I had no choice. So
Wow. So tell me a bit about what your initial approach to the case study was. When you got your case study, what were your first impressions, and how did you decide that, to plan out those 10 weeks?
Yeah. So when I received the plan, I wanted to kind of get to know my clients. So you get the big document, and there's loads of information in there. And I actually immediately started to think how I could actually help them, and thinking of recommendations, which transpired to be the completely wrong approach. Jumping ahead, but I think that's kind of instinctive, like in the things that I've been doing is, right, what do you do? How do you try and help them? And I looked at the example plan that the CISI gave you to try and get the structure, to see how it's structured, and look at the standards as well. And obviously I put things together, start to kind of put some ideas together and think, oh, they might want this and they might want that, etc. And, I got a bit kind of lost, because the plan is quite substantial. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of different aspects that the clients want looking at. Yeah, and I remember obviously I kind of spoke to you about it, and I remember talking about, the things that I'd done, and you basically told us to stop doing it that way. Yeah, just don't do it that way. You're doing it completely wrong. And yeah, basically it was, the kind of focus was the spreadsheets, was starting from the spreadsheets and kind of letting them dictate, what happens, what your recommendations would be, which was completely, I know that sounds really odd, but it was completely a different way of approaching it, and a logical one. I've got to kind of add that as well, but it's not kind of a way in which you would normally do things. So yeah, and I think in reality, when you're working with clients, they normally come with a specific objective. They might say, right, I've got these pensions, they're all scattered around, I want to see if I can just put them in one place because it makes it easier. Or They might be looking at, they've got some cash savings and look for investment options. So they're quite narrow, whereas this case study is massive. There's a little bit of everything. And I think, if you do one thing, it has a knock-on effect on everything else.
Yeah,
and so that obviously
absolutely.
had a bit of a, made things a little bit trickier. And it was, something, definitely an eye opener, put it that way.
Yeah. Well, don't they say in the army, train hard, fight easy?
Well,
And I think this is definitely the train hard version, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. And actually, one of the things I think which you kind of do acknowledge in real life in terms of like, ill health and, things like death, and you look at inheritance and stuff like that, and that's fine. But the kind of extent to this plan is kind of slightly different. And the way I kind of view it at the minute is a bit like, I suppose, being the scientist, it's a bit like Schrodinger's cat. I kind of see the plan a little bit like that. That there's kind of uncertainty, in terms of, obviously Schrodinger's cat is when you put the cat in the box, and there's a mechanism in the box that could either kill it or keep it alive, and you don't know until the box is actually opened and you've actually observed the situation if the cat is if the cat is actually alive or dead. So the theory is that it's both alive and dead, and it's in a kind of state of superposition, I suppose. So I suppose it's similar to financial planning to that extent, especially with this report, is that actually you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And there's uncertainty in everybody's lives, in terms of financial planning, and what happens, and the future of their finances can change depending on events such as illness and death and things like that. And it isn't until you kind of put things in place or plan for some of these eventualities that that kind of steers it down one particular outcome, because if you don't have that, then the outcome could be anything if it's not planned. So I kind of see this case study like that, because you had to factor in things such as first death, second death, critical illness, things like loss of employment, things like that, like loads of different factors, and you have to plan all of these things in, which makes it really, really challenging. So I remember you describing it as a Rubik's Cube, and I think it's definitely like that. So
Yes, it absolutely is, but something that's achievable. But I think you hit the nail on the head there. One of the keys to completing this case study and building your financial plan is to make those decisions, is to start making the decisions, because if you end up with too many options, then when you start to run those options through to the end, then you end up with options on options, don't you? And that's where you end up down a great big hole. But actually going, right, this is the first decision I'm going to make, and whatever it is you're coming across, this is a reasonable decision. This is the reason why I'm going to make this decision. And I've thought about these options, but this is the one I'm going for. Then that's when things start to become clearer and kind of the fog starts to lift, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think when you read the case study, and this is something that I kind of struggled with, I think initially, was that you've got to kind of fall one side of the fence or the other, and sometimes the information in there can conflict, and then sometimes, well, I would see it as conflicted, and sometimes it's not detailed enough, and you think, well, what do they mean by that? But and it kind of boils down to assumptions and making sure that you kind of pick a route, and you think, is that reasonable? Is that rational? And then kind of running with it. I found that quite tricky, to do that and try and unpick that. But yeah, you're right. It's having a clear path.
And so tell me, how did you find the spreadsheets before we get on to my favourite subject of assumptions? I know that you love those now, don't you? But how did you find building the spreadsheets?
I I thought it was all right at spreadsheets. I quite like using spreadsheets, which is probably a bit sad, but that's what I do. But then this is on another level. This is spreadsheets Excel, I suppose. But yeah, I think it's interesting because it's the way in which you kind of develop the spreadsheets to produce figures, and then use them figures to produce a recommendation. And I think it actually gives meaning behind the numbers. So it's not just, oh, it's a number and it means very little. It actually has meaning because you're putting the numbers in, you're taking information provided from the client, using that information, and then you get another number out of it. And that number has a little bit more meaning, and it helps you to kind of strengthen your report writing as well when you do come to your report. So I found, if I'm honest, the spreadsheets challenging, but I could see why they're really beneficial, and it did help eventually,
Yes.
later on.
It takes a bit of time because I think, what you're doing is you're forcing it to think critically about any given piece of information, aren't you? How am I going to interpret this? What am I going to do with that piece of information? And actually, what impact is it having elsewhere? Once I make this decision and I put that figure into my spreadsheet, what's the knock-on effect that maybe I haven't thought about it until I kind of, physically get hold of this number and kind of go, right, that's what I'm doing with it. Because we're forcing our brains to think differently. I mean, I think as an ex-teacher, you probably see that or saw it a lot in your students, that lack of ability to think critically. But it's a really important skill, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I must have spent absolutely hours just on the spreadsheet, like changing it, tinkering with it. And then it does have a knock-on effect, on everything. And I think if you set the spreadsheets up right, then, you can kind of just change one thing and it'll feed through to everything else. And that makes your life a little bit easier, but it's kind of setting it up and getting that set up. And like I say, it is looking at the figures and thinking, does that look right? Because there's a few times where I've looked at some of the figures and I didn't think it looked right or it didn't make sense. And I suppose that leads into what you just said there about critical thinking. It's saying, right, well, is that reasonable? Especially, the kind of, the figures that you put in, assumptions, etc. Is that a reasonable thing to do? And I've kind of learned a lot about, reasoning and justification. There's a lot of that, which I wouldn't have kind of thought really necessarily in, before I did this plan.
And I guess, did you feel that, by me forcing you to step back rather than, trying to put into place recommendations straight away, how did you find that process? I'm guessing, lots of people say to me that it's quite difficult to kind of go, and Jackie's going, hang on a minute. And I'm going, no, I want to make a recommendation. And Jackie's going, no, not yet.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was, to be honest, that was critical to do it, because if I didn't have that, then I would have gone down a path and I would have probably given up. I don't like giving up on things, but I probably would have thought, I don't really know where I'm going with this, or it would have been incoherent. So I think, I kind of taken that very different approach, which kind of forced me out my comfort zone, which was, I was very apprehensive about it and thinking, right, well, okay, well, what do I do here? I didn't really know what to do after that point, and think, right, well, let's just kind of do it and see what happens. But yeah, it was a really important point to kind of say, look, stop, don't do that, leave that to one side. I think you said, if you want to kind of do things, just put some thoughts on a page separately, but just kind of push it to one side and focus on the spreadsheets and be guided by what you've put in the spreadsheets rather than what you think it should be. It should be, objective rather than, what you think it should be, because of, I suppose it's because of, what I've done in the past. That's what you do. And you've got to kind of take that out completely, take out what you've done previously and what you do in your everyday work and detach yourself from that and just kind of be open to a different way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I guess you're not trying to shoehorn an answer out of your spreadsheets, aren't you? We're trying to just let the spreadsheets do the talking, which is, can be quite difficult when we're so used to, being presented with a problem or two by a client and thinking, right, because we know the client so well, we know what the solution's going to be, instead of kind of hanging back and going, hang on, what's the knock-on effects? Let's explore some of that a bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what's difficult with this as well is that normally you can speak to clients, you can say, look, what did you mean by this? What did you, how do you feel about this? What's your feelings behind it? And obviously with this you can't. So you've got to be, it's got to be very right. Well, that's what you've got. That's all you're getting. And you've got to kind of build something from that and justify it. So I think that forces you to think, well, think creatively, which I'm not very creative whatsoever. My mind is very kind of scientific and logical, and that's what it is. There's an answer to it. But, it's a very creative process as well, that you've got to kind of think logically, rationally, what would the clients want? Have like an emotional connection to them, which kind of took over my life for a good period of time.
And did you find that when you were writing up the plan that you felt the urge to write more because you couldn't have that interaction with the clients?
Yeah, because I think I spent a lot of the time trying to justify why I was doing something and justifying why I wasn't doing something. And that's really easy to kind of kind of go down that route, and I had to really kind of pare it back and just emphasize the the reasons why I'm justifying that, and just be really succinct, because you've got a limited amount of space to actually to do all this, and you've got to be really quite, I suppose, quite economical with the words that you use, and be succinct in how you put it together and get the point across as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tricky balance, isn't it, of saying everything you want to say, exploring the options before making those recommendations, and getting all in 60 pages in its entirety. It's a very tricky balance. You can end up being penalised for more of the stuff that you cut out, but that can be as a consequence of too much kind of fluff in it, where because you don't have that interaction, you've gone down that rabbit hole, and then, like you say, you've rolled around in the bottom of the rabbit hole before coming out, and then you've written 6 or 7 pages more than you intended to. So it's a tricky bit. So let's talk about my favourite subject, assumptions. Yeah. How were they? Because did you use assumptions in your advising life up until the point of embarking on the level 7 case study?
Yes, but you have like cash flow software that puts the assumptions in, and they're normally pre-prescribed from the company. So the company will say, right, these are our assumptions, standard set of assumptions, they get put to the software, and that's it. You don't really kind of deal with them much, other than relying them when the software does the spreadsheet. So, and like I say, you can kind of get a little bit of clarity when speaking to clients. You don't have to assume as much about their situation. But I suppose this plan mainly looks at assumptions. It really you have to emphasize the assumptions part. And, I remember you kind of saying about, assumptions, if you're going to look at an assumption, say for school fees, for example, school fee inflation, then you've got to look what it was in the past, what it is now, and what is it likely to be in the future, and then kind of use them 3 elements to come up with something that's, reasonable to throw in. And you wouldn't normally think in that way, but certainly not me, in terms of, when you're putting a plan together in real life, because the kind of software does it for you. But I think it's really interesting, because it's having an understanding of assumptions allows you to have better conversations with clients, because then you can kind of justify where these things come from, and look at what's happened in the past. And I think that's really important, because they're often overlooked when you discussion things like this, with clients. It's important to kind of add that narrative to it, and it softens what is effectively a hard graph with kind of bars on it, so on what the value of your asset is, to something which is a bit more tangible, and saying, well, okay, well, school fees and care costs and things like that, it becomes a little bit more tangible for clients, which I think you often forget when you're in planning. You kind of get engrossed with the kind of technical side, but it's just important to kind of relay that to clients as well.
And do you think moving forward, that's one of the takeaways that you can apply to your business practices from now on?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And I think some of the key aspects of that is it's the plan has kind of forced me to think a little bit more holistically. Like I say, we kind of talk about holistic planning and we offer it, but in reality, some clients, they come with their own ideas, and you might suggest other bits and pieces if they haven't considered them, because that's what good planning is. But this has really kind of changed the way in which you view it, and making sure you kind of look at the kind of full spectrum of the client's financial life, not just what it is now, but looking at potential things like care and, death, ill health. And these are normally taboo things, and people don't, people normally say, when have you made a will? They normally think if they write a will, it's tempted fate. But I think it's also kind of focused, and I think we kind of mentioned it before, about critically thinking and weighing up, the different options carefully, and then obviously using that kind of critical analysis to have trade-offs between, what they want now and what they might want longer term. And I think that's really important, because although it's important that you try and meet all of the objectives, that's important, but it's having that discussion about, okay, look, what is more important to you over this, and kind of having that discussion, because I think that kind of helps the client be more clear in their minds about, okay, what do I really want, and what if this happens, and getting them to think in that way as well.
Yeah, and I think, and that's of vital importance, I think. And, and actually a critical difference of people who believe that they're doing financial planning, who perhaps aren't, because it's those unintended consequences that a lot of financial advisors, traditional financial advisors, aren't aware of. Like you said earlier, the client comes with, their preconceived ideas. Can you sort out my pension? Can you just sort out my, ISAs or my retirement planning or whatever it is? And it's those unintended consequences when you make a decision, you make a recommendation, there's actually having an automatic effect on the estate planning, on, the protection issues of that particular family, and being able to articulate it, have that conversation with the client and go, well, hang on a minute, yes, you could do that if you want to, but these are the unintended consequences. And I want you to know that, these are the unintended consequences so that you can think about them and make an informed decision about whether that is still the right way to go, or whether, you can offer some other scenarios and potential solutions and discuss it with them that maybe it doesn't get them to exactly where they want to go in the short term. But like you mentioned, it actually fulfills their long-term goals and ambition and goals and objectives for their entire family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's that's the other thing which is kind of sharpened it is this client-centered focus, which I thought I had, because that's what I'm in the job for, is really kind of making sure, you're doing the right thing by the client. But, I think what this has kind of taught me is, what does that actually mean? And I think it's not just, yes, okay, the client might say, for example, I've got a load of shares in one company, but they would class themselves as cautious, and that kind of, in my mind, well, that doesn't kind of match. Now it's trying to kind of understand, what does the client mean by that? What's their understanding of it, and their interpretation might be very different to what mine is. But I think it's important. This has kind of taught us to kind of ask them questions.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And things like, why, if they had a shareholding like that, where did they get it from? Have they inherited it? Because there can be emotional attachments that come with things where, like you say, you look at it in the cold light of day and go, what on earth we got that for? In your head, obviously not out loud to a client, but you don't, that's by asking, pausing and having the opportunity to ask those extra questions without passing judgment, that you're understanding, where these investments came from. Was there a particular reason? I've had families I've advised many years ago where they had inherited, a big slug of shares. And so then because the phrase was, I think they used was that because their father had put so much effort into accumulating these shares, that they felt that they had to carry on that tradition, even though it was, they were well without outside their comfort zone as far as risk goes. I mean, they're absolutely off the end of the Richter scale, but still, because of that emotional attachment, and they're the kind of conversations that you can have, aren't they? Because you can't, a piece of paper can't tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one thing which is really kind of emphasized through this is having that kind of the kind of emotions behind finance. Everybody has different views of things, and they'll read things. They're influenced by, the media. They're influenced by me sitting there talking about things, and I think it's kind of understanding what their position is. Why have they set it up in this way? And it might be by accident. It might be deliberate. You can kind of tell. And I think it's important to kind of have them discussions, have that understanding why they're doing that, and then trying to kind of, instead of just tearing it up and say, well, that's no good and we're going to do this instead, it's about kind of understanding, how do we then move them to where they need to be, and then, crucially, protect against mishap and that side of it, which I think a lot of clients generally don't like to think about. So it's kind of your job to kind of, ask the questions and get them to think about it.
And I think maybe, I don't know whether you're going to agree with what I'm going to say now, but I think certainly from my perspective that clients are more likely to implement even those bits that they tend to shy away from, like protection issues, because they feel that they've been heard and they've been understood, and that, their wishes and how they've got to where they've got to and why they've got to where they've got to have all been taken on board by the financial planner who's helping them.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's that kind of case that it won't happen to them, or they're like, they'll say, oh well, if I do this, then, or they think if they take a certain action, something will happen, in terms of something negative will happen, or sometimes they'll go the other way and say, actually, I'm kind of going to do this because I think this is really going to work well for me, and I think it's important that it's not just, okay, look, this is what we're going to do now, but it's things move all the time in finance. Like we just had a budget. The budget will change. The circumstances for clients where they wouldn't have thought so, or personal circumstances might change. So it's just trying to kind of have that conversation that it's not just what we do now. It's about kind of how we make sure it stays on track. And if things do happen, have we set things up in the first place to make sure that we can protect against that, or have we considered these options? And it gives clients that reassurance and that confidence that they've got a robust plan in place, and if these things do happen, then they kind of know which way they're going with it.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So let's go back to the CFP and the level 7 case study. Do you have a feel for how long it took you to go through the whole process with the case study to be successful and pass?
Yeah, so I completed it. So I kind of did the case study, and then I kind of failed it first time, and then I got the kind of results back, and then kind of had another second crack at it. So and I passed it second time, but in terms of the time across everything, I would imagine it's probably going to be, I would say probably about 250 hours. I would say for me personally, I spent most of that on spreadsheets, but that's probably sitting down, working at the desk and kind of, doing things. I think it literally consumed my life for that period of time. Like you go to bed and you think, right, these clients become very real, and, they're not, it's mad, but you kind of thinking, oh, what about this? Or what happens if they do this and do that, etc. And I was kind of talking to my partner about it, and I think she knows the clients really well as well, and kind of what they're doing. And she was getting a bit fed up with it, and, kind of talking about, what do you think they mean by this? And, what would you do in this situation? And, I even gave her the plan to kind of look at, once I'd finished, to kind of get a lay person's view, because she knows not very little about finance, to be fair. So not that kind of sense. So, and I think that was interesting to kind of get her perspective. If you read that, do you understand what it means? And she said, yes. So I thought, well, that's a good start. So it must have been, fairly clear. And if it could be followed by somebody who's kind of doesn't have that, is not embroiled in it, then I think it gives you a different perspective. So yeah, it took a lot of time.
Your partner must have been extremely pleased when you passed then to get you back.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of tucked away in the kind of late evenings and kind of spending weekends and things doing it, and just like talking about it, thinking about it. It's just, it literally does take over your life. You kind of wake up 2:00 in the morning thinking, oh, I forgot about that, or have I put this in, or have I considered that? And then you kind of checking your notes, and it was getting a bit over the top.
Oh dear, gosh. Well, I'm sure she'll be glad to know that you won't have to go through that anytime again. So that's a very positive thing, certainly from a family living perspective.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So we're at the end of our interview now, Chris, but I just wanted to ask you one final question for all of those people out there who are listening, who are thinking about embarking on their journey to become a CFP professional, or maybe they're about to embark on the final step, the level 7 case study. Do you have any tips or advice to share with them?
Yeah, I've got a few. I think from my experience, the key thing, so some of the things, is time management. I think is making sure that you give yourself enough time. It does take a good, like I say, it takes a good chunk of time, from your kind of work, family, etc. And it's making sure you've got that balance, and prioritizing the time in the right place. Your spreadsheets is going to take a lot of the time, and making sure that you don't start typing the report straight away, spreadsheets. And it's okay if you spend 6 weeks doing the spreadsheets and then you report, that's fine. And I think the other one is make sure your technical knowledge is up to scratch as well, and make sure you kind of know like up-to-date rules and regulations and things. And that might sound like an obvious one, but I think one of the other points for me as well is the critically analysing and thinking critically, and just being aware of making sure when you read the case study that you extract the objectives. Make sure you really understand the objectives, what the clients are after, and make sure that you're addressing them as well, and justify every decision. Your assumptions are really important. I kind of failed the first one because the assumptions weren't strong enough. So it's making sure that it's that you emphasize, if you're going to assume something, make sure you justify it and say, right, I'm assuming this because of this, and really strengthen that, because your kind of recommendations will fall down if that's not, if that's not strong enough. So yeah, and I suppose the kind of last one, which is kind of easy for me to say, is make sure that you kind of, you're kind of managing your stress levels and, kind of stay confident. And I know I kind of relied on you a reasonable amount to kind of keep you kind of on the straight and narrow, and it's very easy to kind of get lost in this. So, I would definitely, recommend that, you kind of seek like some form of support or some form of help to kind of just give you that kind of clarity, that sense check to think, no, right, do this and and just give you that, clear your thought process and make sure you can kind of work through it methodically. And and don't be afraid to kind of ask questions as well. It's really important that you kind of understand what's going on and doing it from there.
Fantastic. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to interview you today. Thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to different people who have different experiences of gaining their Certified Financial Planner certification, or maybe developing the financial planning profession at large. If you know anybody who you think might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, then please do pass on our details. That's it for me. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. See you again soon. Bye for now.